后来，那目前应该是有在做了吧？好，那我看一下哦，去看一下我自己的频道，看有没有在播，要不然到时没有播就很尴尬。我看一下哦，看一下我自己的频道，看有没有在播，要不然到时没有播就很尴尬。好了，我现在这样应该没问题。好，来吧，开始。
Perfect. We're going to create a new block of CSS. We're going to use a dot to target a class. So this time we're still targeting the subscribe dash button. But this time we're going to add :hover, open bracket, close bracket.
好，那他就是说这次要新加入的东西是一个叫做 hover 的东西，就是你鼠标它放在上面时，它有一个悬浮的动作，这样。好了 ，hover。OK，然后哦，它是重新开一个哦，好，那就是这边噔噔噔这样，然后这边低调，然后点 hover，冒号，好吧，这个写法我没有看过，有必要。对。
So inside these are styles that will apply only when we hover over the button. That's what this :hover means. For example, we can set the background dash color to green. Now let's save our file and refresh the page.
我先要改一下做法，就是换一下，不要用整个 display 好了，这样让大家看得到目前在干嘛。这样好，那个是它在上面，那我们先把它变这样 ，OK。然后好，那我们回来这边，OK。然后现在是长这副模样，然后我们还要再开一个视窗，让大家看得到，对，就是修改后的样子。With Safari，我们是 bottoms 还是那个 bottoms？ 然后 open with Safari， 哦，好好记忆体哦，可可。然后这个就删掉。好。
And when we hover over this button, you'll notice that it's green. So the way that this works is that if we are scroll up almost instantly. So how do we make this transition? And that looks pretty good.
太慢，所以
over this button. So when we hover over it, we want to invert the colors. So we target the join button with a dot, join button, and we're going to add a pseudo class called :hover. And now all the styles inside, we're going to add, and again, we're going to click on it. It gets even, maybe 0.8 out. Increase the opacity between 0. So we got rid of the refresh. So when we hover over our subscribe button,
所以它是做了2个包含部分。那前面写第一个是 class， 然后这是 class 它冒号不要做什么动作这样子。那它这边是写了说它那个 background 要变成绿色，所以这个是 background 绿 green green green。好，然后这边，然后 background 它怎么写？然后 active 什么意思？待会。
example of a pseudo class is .subscribe button :active. So the active pseudo class activates when we click on the element. So when we click on the button, we can set the background dash color to blue. Let's save this and
OK， 所以hover active 这样子，然后因为后面是什么换成 blue，OK，、这样。好，那我们来试试看，有个那个 click， 放上去变绿色，然后按一下，好，你有没有看到变蓝色
？And refresh. Now when we hover over, we're going to apply these styles, so the background color is going to be green. And then when we click, we're going to apply the active styles, and then the background color is going to be blue. So let's look at our design and see what kind of hover styles we have. Refresh. So when we hover over our subscribe button, it seems to turn a little bit more light. And if we click it, it becomes even lighter. So the way to make our button lighter is using a new property that I'm going to introduce. So let's get rid of these for now. Let's save and refresh. So we got rid of those pseudo class styles. We're going to set a CSS property called opacity. So opacity tells us how see-through an HTML element is. It takes a value between 0 and 1. A value of 1 means that this element is completely normal. So if we save this and refresh, you can see that if we hover over it, it's completely normal. And as we decrease the opacity, let's decrease it to 0.7, the element starts to fade. So if we decrease it even more to 0.3,
opacity， 我不知道 opacity 什么意思，看一下 opacity word up opacity。Let's see opacity 不透明度OK 所以让它变得比较原本这样1是完全正常的，然后0.7就让它稍微变得透明一点点这样那这边就是不能 background color， 而是要用不透明度 opacity。然后他刚讲说1到0嘛，就在这里变换，然后1是完全正常，然后0.7是稍微变得有点不透明，变透明这样。他这边写0.7，好，那OK， 那效果有点像。
3, refresh. Now it's even more faded. So the opacity is used to fade out an element. If we go from 1 to 0, the element is going to fade out. So we set it to 0 and refresh. Now it's basically completely transparent and see-through. If the opacity goes from 0 to 1, that means the element's going to start to fade in. 0.8. So it's going to be a little bit see-through, but not totally see-through. So let's refresh. Next, let's set the active styles. So in our design, if we click on this, it gets even lighter. So we're going to set an even lower opacity to make our button fade out even more when we click on it. Let's set it to something like 0.4 or 0.5, let's say. Save it and refresh. Now when we hover over it, now when we click, the button gets lighter. And we can compare that to our design. And that looks pretty good to me. Now we're going to work on the hover.
所以点下去的时候，它变得更加透明，所以这边的 opacity 要变得这样，这样。Okay, let's try. OK， 有变得更透明了，有没有看到？悬浮，有变更透明了。好。
Styles for our join button. So if we look at our design, the colors for this join button sort of inverts. So the background color and the text color, they reverse. So to do that, we're going to go into our code. And again, we're going to target the join button with a dot, join button. And we're going to add a pseudo class called :hover. And now all the styles inside here will apply when we hover over this button. So when we hover over it, we want to invert the colors. So we want to set the background dash color to our text color, which is this. Copy and paste.
Hover， 然后这个 color 是一样嘛？好 ，OK。
And we also want to set the text color to our background color. So we're going to switch them up. Let's copy, paste here. Save it and refresh. And now when we hover over our
效果是你在上面的时候，就是整个会调换过来这样。 颜色会调换过来，所以这边的 background color 应该是 RGB 这样子，这也不是 white， 这样子，应该这边是 RGB， 然后它的那个 border 不是 border color， 想想哦，白变黑嘛，所以这边不对，这是蓝色变白色，所以这边的话，蓝色这边应该是要变白色，但是那 border color 没有变，所以这边应该也是这样。然后可是它的 color 是字的部分是 white， 或许 white 这样 ，OK， 那我试试看哦。有整个变了，有没有看到？好，
our join button,
看到有没有什么
that looks
细节
pretty
要
good.
修？
The next thing is when we click the join button, you'll notice that it also fades out. So we're going to add an active pseudo class to this button as well. So target the join button class and add a pseudo class called active. So these styles will activate when we click this element.
那这里不用写那么多指令，像什么 solid， 然后这只是说变换颜色而已。hover， 对，基本上就是颜色变换，所以就是1、2、3这边，然后这边都不用写，这是多余的。然后再下来我们要再写一个指令，是那个hover， 然后叫什么 active tiv， 它在动的时候要怎么写？然后动的时候它要把变得更不透明，是这样吗？
So let's set the opacity to maybe 0.7 maybe. Save it, refresh, click it, okay. So I think that looks close enough. So 0.7 looks pretty good. So that is how we set hover styles and other pseudo classes with our CSS code. Next, we're going to learn how to transition smoothly between these two styles. So for example, if we go back,
opacity 会是那个，它用多少0.0？用0.8嘛，就用0.7好了，0.7这样子应该没问题。然后，哦，这里少了一个那个 opacity， 是0.7，那这边按更透明就是0.3这样，但应该是统一比较好，参考一下什么都是没0.5，好 ，OK， 好按。哦，我错了，它的效果不是这样，它要的是上面悬浮没有变透明，但是按下去会变半透明，所以这样有变蓝，然后按下去蓝透明，这样才对。好，那就往下一个。
back into our project and we hover over this button, you'll notice that the background color and the text color change smoothly. But for our colors, it changes almost instantly. So how do we make this transition? So to do that, we're going to colors. If the background color and the text color change smoothly. But for our colors, it changes almost instantly. So how do we make this transition? So to do that, we're going to scroll up to our subscribe button first. We're going to add a property called transition. So transition property takes two values. The first one is what we want to transition. So in our case, we want to transition the opacity smoothly. So we want to
transition 什么 transaction 那个 CSS transaction SS 还是 transition？转场 hover active 或者是用 JavaScript 设定状态变化。哦 transition， 所以是用来转场用的嘛，然后一个多个转场设定用逗点分开，每一个效果用它每一个设定都描述一个特殊转场效果。好了， 接着操作。
Want to smoothly fade out the button when we hover over it instead of instantaneously. So let's transition the opacity. And the second value is how long this transition will take. For example, let's set it to 1s, which is 1 second. End it with a semicolon and save. Let's go back and refresh. And now when we hover over our button, you'll notice that the opacity changes smoothly. Now it might be a little bit hard to see, so let's change this to 0.1 to show you the effect. Refresh. So now you can see that the opacity is changing smoothly over 1 second. So this is how you transition between different styles when you're hovering over them. Now let's set it back to 0.8, and we're going to change 1 second because it's a little bit too long. So usually a good transition duration is something like 0.15 seconds. So it's pretty fast, but it's not too fast and it's not too slow. Let's go to our webpage and refresh. Now when we hover over it, we get a nice smooth transition. It might be a little bit hard to tell, but we do get a nice smooth transition instead of what we had before, which transitioned immediately.
所以它指定的是这个东西的 opacity 的不透明度的部分，不透明 opacity， 然后要是多少？0.15哦。这样0.15秒。我try。它不是马上不见，它会有一点点延迟，这样。这是
Let's work on the
transition 定义转场效果。
join button now. So this one is a lot easier to see the difference. Let's scroll down to the join button. And again, we're going to add.
就是稍微有点慢啊，这个是马上就变了，这样。OK， 然后再来，如果他要在 join pattern 用一样的效果，那基本就是这边用那个一样是 opacity 嘛 ，OP， 这是全程的人来，然后那个 opacity。然后一样看这是不是这样写。
Add a transition. So we're going to add transition, and we're going to give it two values: what we want to transition and how long. First, let's transition the background dash color, and how long we're going to transition for 1 second as an example. Let's save our file and refresh. Now when we hover over the join button, the background color changes smoothly over 1 second.
哦，它是一双背景，所以假如我这样做嘞，看一下。哦，原来那个背景有变，那我这边是不是可以多写个那个 transition？ 如果他依照他这样写，就是那个它这原本是指引 opacity 的不透明度嘛，它这边是指定那一个背景颜色变换 BSK background color。color， 然后用多少？它一样是用1秒，这样。
But you'll notice that the text color changes immediately, whereas the text color here also kind of transitions. So to make the text color transition as well, we need to add another property to transition. So we can actually transition multiple properties. We just have to separate it with a comma. So if we have a comma here, we can add another property to transition. This time I'm going to transition the color, and we're also going to give it a duration, which is 1 second. Changes immediately, whereas the text color here also kind of transitions. So to make the text color transition as well, we need to add another property to transition. So we can actually transition multiple properties. We just have to separate it with a comma. So if we have a comma here, we can add another property to transition. This time I'm going to transition the color, and we're also going to give it a duration, which is 1 second. So how long it takes to transition this property. Save it and refresh.
color， 它这边说要写个逗点，然后可以写一个什么 color。 这样子。
Now when we hover over this button, it will transition both background color and the color smoothly over 1 second. And that's basically how transitions work. So sometimes you might be tempted to put this transition property into the hover because you think that we want to transition when we hover, so we have to put it here. Now the problem with this is that if we refresh, when we hover over the button, everything looks good, but as soon as we hover out, the styles change immediately. And that's because, remember, these styles only apply when we're hovering. So if we are hovering, then we have a transition. But as soon as we take off the hover, it's the same thing as having no transition at all. So that's one common pitfall of the transition property. So let's move it back here where it should be. So just make sure that you put the transition always in this sort of base CSS style. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is how to create shadows. If we go to
为什么不直接写在 hover 里面？是因为它只有在 hover 的时候才会变换。那如果我一直把它写在 button 里面的话，就只有就是它整个都可以沿用到，是这个意思吧？从这里，对，包括它颜色慢慢变回去了，就会慢慢变回去这样子。然后稍微理清一下，这边的 transition， 它这边的 transition 是转场效果套用在，因为 hover 它是有东西放上去变，然后移开再变，所以在背光 color 上面它会有背景颜色会有变化。但是因为它没有指定字的部分，所以字的部分它会自己变回来。那就算指定字的话，懂意思。好吧，这有一点细微的差别。写在 join button 里面是指说，它东西移开之后会有。东西方向移开都会有转场效果，对。但如果我全部写在那个 hover 上面，就只有 hover 上面会有效果，好吧？大概懂它的意思。
To our project and we look at our design, I'm going to zoom in here. When I hover over the tweet button, it creates a faint shadow under the button. So we're going to learn how to create this. So let's zoom out for now. We're going to go down to the tweet button styles, and the shadow is just another CSS property. So the property for a shadow is box-shadow, colon. Now, box shadow actually takes 4 values. So I'm going to
box shadow。那写在 tweet button 里面就是整个都可以作用吗 ？box shadow。OK。然后还有说
set the values to 0 for now, and then we're going to change them one by one to see how they work. Let's save this and refresh. And now we do have a shadow, but we can't see it because it's right underneath the button. So the first value here determines the horizontal position of the shadow. For example, I can set it to 10 pixels, and if I save, the shadow will appear 10 pixels to the right. The second value sets the vertical position of the shadow. For example, if I set it to 10 pixels, in the second value, it will push it 10 pixels down. So now you can see we actually do have a shadow 10 pixels to the right and 10 pixels down from the button. Now the third value here is the blur. So if we set the blur to maybe 10 pixels, save, refresh, now we can actually change it to something like red. Save it, refresh, and we get a red shadow. The shadow becomes blurred. And the last value is obviously the color. So we can actually change it to, now the shadow becomes, so if we set the blur to maybe 10 pixels, save, refresh, now the shadow becomes blurred. And the last value is obviously the color. So we can actually change it to whatever we want. We can actually
是左边、右边一个下面，然后最后它那个10 pixel 是说它的模糊程度。
change it to something like red. Save it, refresh, and we get a red shadow. So this is basically how shadows work. We have a horizontal position, a vertical position, blur, and color. So don't worry, the more that you work with shadows, the more you'll get familiar with what these 4 values can do. So let's try creating a more realistic shadow. Usually shadows aren't red or any color. They're usually kind of a darker shade of whatever they're covering. So to create a color like that, we're going to need a new way of measuring color. So let's get rid of this, and we're going to use something called RGBA. RGBA is the same thing as RGB, except there's an A value. So this A value essentially means the opacity of the color, how see-through it is. We can set the RGB to 0, 0, 0. That gets us to black, as we learned. And then the fourth value is our A value. If we set it to 1 and save, this is going to be pure black. But as we decrease the A value, the color is going to get more and more faded out and more transparent. So if we decrease it to 0.6, save and refresh, now this color is getting more transparent and faded out. So a pretty natural color for shadow is something pretty faint, like 0.15. So for shadows, we usually don't want it to be too noticeable. Shadows are best when they're very subtle. And now we kind of want to move the shadow a little bit closer to the button, so it looks a little more natural. So let's actually move it maybe 5 pixels and 5 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So that's how we create a natural looking shadow with the box shadow property. We have 4 values: the horizontal position, vertical position, the blur, and the color measured with RGBA. The A value means opacity, or how see-through this color is. The final step of this lesson is to only make this shadow appear when we hover over the button. So for example, for here, if we hover over, we can see the shadow. If we're not,
copy. Oh.
they're usually kind of a darker shade of whatever they're covering. So to create a color like that, we're going to need a new way of measuring color. So let's get rid of this, and we're going to use something called RGBA. RGBA is the same thing as RGB, except there's an A value. So this A value essentially means the opacity of the color, how see-through it is. We can set the RGB to 0, 0, 0. That gets us to black, as we learned. And then as we decrease the 0 and 1, 5 pixels and 5 pixels. A natural looking shadow with the box shadow property. We have 4 values: the horizontal position, vertical position, the blur, and the color measured with RGB. The A value means opacity, or how see-through this color is. The final step of this lesson is to only make this shadow appear when we hover over the button. So for example, for here, if we hover over, we can see the shadow. If we're not, the shadow's gone. So this is another style of button that we can create. So let's use what we learned so far. Remember, we first use a dot to target the class. So we're going to target the tweet-button class. We're going to add a pseudo class here called hover. And then we're going to move our shadow into the hover pseudo class. Let's cut and paste in here. So remember, the way this works is that, let's refresh first. If we are not hovering over the button, we get all of these styles. If we are hovering over the button, we're going to get these styles, these hover styles.
Hover， 然后这边的是那个 box。这样子，哦，所以它移上去的时候，就会有一个那个悬浮的东西在上面，这样。
As well as all of these. So these styles get added on when we hover. So now when we refresh and we hover over this button, we're going to get a pretty subtle shadow.
OK， 这样。有点慢。那 tweet， 可是我没有 hover 上去啊，奇怪。分手，哦，有，移掉了。一张有一个 hover， 有一个 shadow， 有。
Shadow. Not perfect, but I think it's close enough to what we want. Now the last thing we're going to do is to transition the shadow. So we can actually transition the shadow pretty easily by just adding the transition property.
那我试试看。Transition， 他说要用在这边呢，这样 transition， 然后他用哪个？到 shadow 那个0.5x好了，5x， 这样嘞。哦有，好。
And we're going to tell it what we want to transition and how long. So you want to transition the box dash shadow, and let's transition it to something natural, like 0.15 seconds. Now save and refresh. Now when we hover over this button, we get a nice transition on the shadow like this. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is, I realized I forgot to change the durations here. So let's change it to 0.15 and 0.15. Let's save it and refresh. So now this looks something like what we have in our designs. So we just learned some intermediate HTML skills, such as creating hover effects, other pseudoclasses, transitions, and shadows. Here are some more exercises from famous websites that you can try to copy. This time we're also going to copy the hover styles. As always, you can find these solutions and more exercises below the video. In this lesson, we're going to learn about one of the most useful tools for web development called the Chrome DevTools. And we're going to use the DevTools to get perfect colors for our buttons. So first of all, what are the Chrome DevTools? So I find that it's a lot easier to demonstrate it than to try to explain it. So let's go to our website. And we're going to right click in an empty area. And we're going to click Inspect. And this will open up the DevTools. So the cool thing about this is that we can now see all the HTML on our page. If we drill down here, we can see all the buttons. So this is a great way to visualize the HTML as well as the CSS on our page. If I click into one of these buttons, I can see all the CSS that is applied to this button. So what's even better is that we can open the DevTools in any website that we want. So we can actually open it in supersimple.dev, and you can see all the HTML that is on this website as well as all the CSS. So this is a really great tool where you can open it in any website that you want and see the exact styles that they're using on that website. The next feature I want to show you is this pointer icon in the top left. So instead of trying to find these buttons in all of this HTML, we can actually click this pointer icon and it will let us hover over any element on the web page and show it down here. So if we hover over this tweet button and click it, it will find the element for us in the HTML. And now we can look at these styles here to see what kind of styles and, more importantly, what kind of background color is set on this button so that we can get a perfect background color. So one thing to note is that this background color is actually another way of measuring color. So currently we learned about RGB. Now we have another way of measuring color, and this is called hex. It's basically the same as RGB. The first two characters here, 1 and D, represent how much red, the second two represent how much green, and the third two represent how much blue. So with a little bit of math, we can convert from hex to RGB. So I just Google a hex to RGB calculator, and I find any calculator, and then I use it to convert the hex value. So I'm going to copy this into the calculator and then convert it, and it will give me the RGB value. So it'll do that math for me. So that's just another way of measuring color called hex. The next feature I want to show you in the DevTools is this Computed tab. So this tab actually shows us all the final styles that are applied to this element. So we can actually scroll down here and we can find the background color in the RGB value. We can also find things like the height, the final calculated height, the final calculated width, so that we can get the perfect size as well as the perfect background color. So let's actually just use the background color here. And we're going to copy this and paste this into our code. So we're going to get an exact color instead of trying to guess it like we were before. So if I copy and paste here, save it, and now we refresh. Now our button has the exact same color as what we have here. So the same thing happens for the join button. Let's click this icon here and hover over the join button to find it in the HTML. Click, and now we can see all these styles, all the final computed styles on the join button. So most importantly, we can find the border color, which is this. Let's copy it and put it into our CSS so that we can get a perfect color. End it with a semicolon to follow the syntax rules. Okay, copy it there and copy it here. Now we're going to save, refresh, and now our button color is going to match the design exactly. So that's how you use the DevTools to get perfect color for our HTML elements. Now we're going to learn about the CSS box model, which basically allows us to add space between our elements like this, as well as add space inside our element to make it bigger. The first part of the box model is spacing on the outside of the element. This is called margin. If we look at our code, we already worked with margin before. Here we set the margin right to 8 pixels. That means that we added space on the outside of the button on the right of 8 pixels. If we change the margin right to 30 pixels, for example, and save and refresh, now there's 30 pixels of space on the outside on the right side of the button. So we can add margin to all 4 directions: top, right, bottom, and left. Let's try adding margin to the left side of the button this time. We're going to add margin left of 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And that adds space on the outside of the button on the left of 20 pixels. So that's basically how margin works. It lets us add spacing on the outside of the element. The second part of the box model is spacing on the inside of the element. So basically all the spacing in here around our text. So currently, if we look at our code, we're setting the height and width of our buttons. And this is not actually a good idea. I'll show you why. I'm going to scroll down to the join button because it's a little easier to see. And I'm going to change the text to join my channel. Save it and refresh. And you'll notice that the text is actually overflowing the button like this. And that's because if we scroll up, we're setting the height and the width. That means that we're forcing the button to have a height of 36 pixels and a width of 62 pixels. But here, notice that our content is too big. So what we want to do is to remove these lines and save it and refresh the page. And by default, our button actually adjusts the size automatically based on the content. So now instead of setting the height and the width, we're going to achieve the same thing by adding spacing on the inside of the button. So the spacing on the inside of the button is called padding. Let's go into our spacing on the inside content and refresh the page. And by default, our button actually adjusts the size automatically based on the content. So now instead of setting the height and the width, we're going to achieve the same thing by adding spacing on the inside of the button. So the spacing on the inside of the button is called padding. Let's go into our code and give it a try. So we're going to add padding dash left.
所以不要用长宽去限制按钮，因为它没有办法做动态变化。动态变化随着内容，它没有办法这样，内容没办法随着它已经被固定好的那个高和宽去做变化。所以他意思就是说，那个就像他以 join button 为范例，他希望把这边给弄掉。对，那为什么把这边弄掉？它这里就是因为大小被限制住了嘛。然后如果大小被限制住，它的那个字变多的话，它就会突出去。好，那我改一下 ，join my channel，join my channel，join channel，OK，这样，然后要怎么改
of 30 pixels. Save it and
按钮最外面那个是 margin， 然后字跟那一个框框中间的东西叫做 padding，OK，padding，padding， 它在哪里改 ？padding border width padding left。哦，是 padding left。padding left 30 pixels.
refresh. And you can see that padding adds spacing on the inside of the button. And just like margin, we can set padding in all 4 directions. So let's try adding padding dash top to 20 pixels. Save that and refresh. And now you can see that we added padding on the top by 20 pixels. So we can actually use the Chrome Dev tools that we learned earlier to visualize the margin and padding of our elements. Let's go into a blank area of our webpage, and we're going to right click and inspect, and then click this top left icon, and then click our subscribe button. So I'm going to drag this down, and then we're going to go into the Computed tab. So this section is basically the box model. We have our margin, which is the space on the outside of the element. You can see that highlighted in orange. We have the border, which we learned earlier, and we have the padding, which is the space on the inside of the element, which you can see highlighted in green. Buttons by default have a padding of 6 pixels on the left and right, and 1 pixel on top and bottom. So let's click this top left again and go to our join button and click this button. In this example, we have padding on the top of 20 pixels, which is what we have in our code. We have padding on the left of 30 pixels, also what we have in our code. And then we have a default padding of 6 pixels on the right and 1 pixel at the bottom. And for this button, we have a border of 1 pixel wide, which you can see here in our code. So all of these combined make up the CSS box model. This basically determines how much space an element takes up on the page and how far it is away from other elements. So now that we learned the box model, we're going to use it to recreate our design here. So currently, if we look at our code, we're using height and width. Let's replace this with the box model. Let's get rid of this and save it and refresh. And now our button's back to what it was before. And now we're going to add padding to this button so that it matches the design at the bottom here. So let's add some padding.
subscribe bottom 它不能已经改掉 high width 改掉了，然后它把它改成padding 利用 select 吗
dash top of 10 pixels. So we'll add spacing on the inside of the button at the top here of 10 pixels. We're also going to add padding dash bottom of 10 pixels. Let's save that and refresh.
bottom
Okay, so now we have space at the top and bottom. So that looks pretty close. We're also going to add space on the inside, on the left and right. So we're going to add padding dash left of 16 pixels. And padding on the right of 16 pixels. So let's save that and refresh. And I think this looks close enough. So using padding, we added spacing on the inside of our button. And the good thing about this is that if we change the text like this and save it and refresh, the button will resize with the text, but it will keep the spacing on the inside. So using padding is a better alternative to height and width. So let's save that and refresh the page. And let's actually move these buttons back closer together. So currently, if we scroll up, we have margin on the right of 30 pixels. So spacing on the outside of the button on the right of 30 pixels. We're going to change it back to 8 pixels so that it's closer like we have in our design. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, one thing you'll notice is that our buttons are not aligned with each other. So the join button is all the way at the top, while our subscribe button is a little bit below. So why is this happening? By default, the browser tries to align our buttons based on the text. So notice that the text is in one line like this. So that's the default behavior of the browser. This is because browsers in the beginning were mostly text-based. Now, to override this behavior and align everything to the top like we had before, we can go into our CSS and we're going to add a property called vertical-align. And we're going to set this to like this. So that's the default behavior of the browser. This is because browsers in the beginning were mostly text-based. Now, to override this behavior and align everything to the top like we had before, we can go into our CSS and we're going to add a property called vertical-align. And we're going to set this to top. So instead of aligning the buttons based on the text like this, we're just going to align everything to the top. If we save that, and refresh, now the subscribe button is aligned to the top, which is right there. Let's do the same thing for the tweet button. We're going to scroll down, and we're going to, which is right. So instead of aligning the buttons everything to the top like we had before, we can go into our CSS and we're going to add a property called vertical-align. And we're going to set this to top. So instead of aligning the buttons based on the text like this, we're just going to align everything to the top. If we save that and refresh, now the subscribe button
Oh. 然后用，但为什么是用 vertical？ 好奇怪哦，因为它不是水平嘛，大家之前用 vertical line， 就是它不用字做对齐，然后它是用区块跟区块要整个贴上面这样子，所以是不能用一开始预设的那个以字为基准去对齐，而是要用区块，所以 vertical align 水平对齐，然后用 top 往上这样。好，那我试试看，因为它是没有差嘛，有往上，可以。
is aligned to the top, which is right there.
Okay.
Let's do the same thing for the tweet button. We're going to scroll down and we're going to add vertical-align : top here as well. Save and refresh. And now everything's aligned properly again. Now let's work on the join button. I'm going to scroll down and remove this extra text here. Save it and refresh. And now we're going to go to our CSS for the join button. So I'll scroll up to right here, and we're going to adjust the padding. So let's actually just borrow the padding from the subscribe button because they look pretty similar.
所以这边的话，我们要把那个就我们 channel 给改掉，然后那个 bottom 这边join bottom 这边 left and right 也都改，不知道它改多少数。
So I'll scroll up here and copy these and just move them down to the join button.
OK， 他说你就把那 top bottom left right 都卡过来，然后 join bottom 也是这样，嘣嘣，这样。那应该会就是长一模模一样的哦。但还是差一点哎，为什么？为什么？有为什么？看一下 border radius， 看一下。
Right here. Save that and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good, except our join button looks a little bit off. It looks a little bit taller than our subscribe button. And that's because the border actually adds a little bit of size to this button. So it adds 1 pixel on the top and bottom. That's why this button is taller than the subscribe button. So to compensate, we're actually going to reduce the padding at the top and the bottom by 1 pixel. Save it and refresh. And now they're the same size.
OK。那这边的话，因为它有一个 border 占1 pixel， 所以它要再往下调，然后 padding top。应该是 top 或 bottom 应该都可以。都要，因为它上下都有线，所以这边要这样9 pixels。OK， 好耶。那 tweet 就有点大了，tweet 就有点大。
We have 9 pixels of space on the inside plus the 1 pixel of the border width. And that matches the 10 pixels of space on the inside of the subscribe button. And I'll leave changing the tweet button up to you as an exercise. So that is the CSS box model.
改 CSS 的部分，改 tweet 的部分。tweet 它的3674，看一下，就是 tweet 跟它长得不太一样。tweet。
Join button. I'm going to scroll down and remove this extra text here. Scroll up to right here, and we're going to adjust the padding. Now we're going to go down and remove.
能够等大，然后 real solid pointer back pixels 这应该没错。为什么我的tweet图变那么大？为什么？为什么？为什么我的 tweet 真那么大一个
This extra text here, and now everything's aligned properly again. Pull in top. Here is.
是他没有加 top。我加 top 啊！我加 top 啊！为什么它那么大？所以我说为什么 tweet 那么大？为什么我不懂？看一下 high width border none border radius 8 pixels font size 15 pixels font weight 为什么？
as well. Save and refresh. And now everything's aligned properly again. Now let's work on the join button. I'm going to scroll down and remove this extra text here. Save it and refresh. And now we're going to go to our CSS for the join button. So I'll scroll up to right here, and we're going to adjust the padding. So let's actually just borrow the padding from the subscribe button because they look pretty similar. So I'll scroll up here and copy these and just move them down to the join button right here. Save that and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good, except our join button looks a little bit off. It looks a little bit taller.
哦，好吧，或许不是他的问题，是我的那个 subscribe。好啦，那 tweet，因为它都是大，因为我小写啊，好啊，不懂。
Pixel on the outside of the box model to get yourself more familiar with this concept and these properties.
哦，
And these properties.
3D click, margin and padding together. 1, 2, 3, scratch, strETCH. Recreate design how to using the box model. 好，这可能是个不错练习。好啦，那今天就开到这边。对，反正就没想到其实 HTML 和 CS 这种东西要做不难，但是要熟。好，那我想或许以后这真的都有个人网页作为基础呢，这样然后去试着去抠个东西出来。好，不管那反正把这些基本技能都学会了，然后之后就是慢慢的去复习去补所需的东西，这样子。好，那今天就开到这边，拜。或许晚上会再开吧，不确定。对，但晚上可能就是练习英文口说，因为我英文口说非常烂，对，那个不论是 pronunciation 还是 accent，都是有一点点，不是有一点点很奇怪这样。就是大家都会讲英文啊，但实际上，你讲好不好，或者是你讲的跟英文的那个 native speaker 讲的像不像，是另外一回事。对，好，总之就是多练习。好，那今天先这样，拜拜。